Hi, everybody. Hope you had a nice lunch. Hope the food coma has not taken over. Welcome to Using Customer Data. I'm Tom O'Connor. I'm the Director of Enterprise Consulting for the Tessitura Network. I'll tell you what that means in a few minutes. I'm joined by two fine fellows over here, Matt Tarr, who is the Director of Digital Architecture for the American Museum of Natural History, and Micah Walter, the Director of Digital and Emerging Media at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. We're going to be talking about customer data, which is a very, very broad topic, so this could go a number of different ways. We're going to share some initial, in their case studies, in my case, thoughts and frameworks that we hope will then lead into a robust Q&A section and discussion at the end of this, because I really want to hear what you all are puzzling about these days on this particular topic, but we'll give you, hopefully, some good food for thought here. So before we get to the case study portion, I'll just give you a little bit of a, let's call it level setting the stage a bit. Some of you are familiar with Tessitura Network. Both of these organizations use the Tessitura software. This session, however, is not about the Tessitura software. My role at Tessitura is heading up, as I said, the Enterprise Consulting Division, which I jokingly refer to as the non-technical consulting division. We provide organizational consulting around marketing, fundraising, and CRM strategy. We're not necessarily going in and training you on the system and all of those kinds of things. So we're not necessarily going to talk about systems and tools per se when we talk about Tessitura. I just want to talk to you about bigger concepts. So, excuse me, prior to joining Tessitura, which was only for me about 6 months ago, I was the head of marketing for the Roundabout Theater Company in New York, a Broadway and off-Broadway theater producer. So my roots originally are in the, I don't know who said that, but good for you. My roots are in the performing arts world. However, some of these concepts we're going to be talking about are fairly standard across the board, though obviously we understand the unique challenges of the museum sector, specifically as it comes to anonymous visitors and the like. So I am going to lean a bit on some performing arts ideas as I go through my portion of this, but I'm not going to stay in that world per se. So three sort of major pillars of my brief piece at the beginning here are going to be really framing CRM, so talking not about CRM platforms, not talking about CRM technologies, but talking about CRM strategy and really what that means. Secondly, thinking about really data-centric questions for your organizations. In my portion, I'm not going to talk per se about personalization. I'm going to talk more about how customer data can help you answer central questions for your organizations. And also, always a fun part of the conversation, where to begin, which I know can be somewhat of a paralyzing question for some of these topics. So I first want to spend a little bit of time, as I said, framing the conversation around CRM. I think a lot of the time when you hear the phrase CRM, you think technology, which is great. I work for Tessitura. I think that's great. However, for the purposes here, I want to zoom out a bit, and I think we need a framework to think about the full scope of what CRM entails. And I'm sorry that the screen is not as big as I would like it to be, but I want to talk about CRM in a broader way, not just about the tools that we use to carry out the relationships we form with our customers. So this is actually a framework developed by an Australian entrepreneur named Ross Dawson. I've included a link to his website down there. This is one that I particularly, that resonates with me and that I know resonates with a lot of folks that I've spoken to about this topic. But when we're thinking about customer data and we're thinking about customer relationship management, we need to really be thinking in these 4 dimensions. And I'll walk through them if you can't read them in the back. The top is really the top level business objective or top level CRM objective that you have for your institution. So in this case, and this was not developed for a museum, this is something for a for-profit company that he was making this for, but that top level objective is increased profitability, with some somewhat subcategories talking about the ways to achieve that particular objective. The next level down being customer communication, meaning what you're serving to customers, the strategies and action plans you're putting in place of what you're serving your customers based on what you know about them. The next level down, segmentation, the ways in which we slice and dice our audiences and visitors to really get a sense of A, their behaviors, but B, their interests, and so on and so forth. And this bottom row, which we frankly speak to a lot in the work we do at Tessitura, is what Dawson calls the enablers. So that is, on one level, integrated systems that allow us to get all of our customer data in one place across the various ways it comes in, but also the sort of interpersonal organizational elements that make CRM a possibility, which are not to be underestimated, as I think probably many people can attest to. So just as important as integrated systems is a clear responsibility for customer relationship management in an organization. Perhaps some of you, if you're working in this sphere, are asking yourselves, who owns this? Whose job is this? That doesn't necessarily fall into the same buckets, shall we say, as traditional org structures. And also consistent data acquisition is another key piece on the bottom row there. I know that that's a huge challenge for the museum sector, and I know that one of the recommendations we make early on is to be really crafting strategies to address that particular piece, what the value is to your audiences and your visitorships to give you that particular data. So that's as wonky as I'm going to get. The rest of this is going to be pretty digestible, I promise. Excuse me. But I just want to hit on sort of 3 categories of customer data that you can be thinking about harvesting from a unified either platform or approach. I should say that they're much like any other aspect of a business strategy. This can be developed in an iterative fashion. So I'm not going to be showing you the predictive analytics that you can use, say, 5 years down the road from starting a CRM strategy. I'm going to be sort of giving you the crawl before the run kind of approach here. But the first category I want to talk about is geography, which I think is pretty straightforward. I know that it's no news to a lot of the museums in the room, the kinds of business questions you can answer by capturing the geography of your audiences, but then taking that and attaching it to an individual and turning it into an opportunity to communicate with them based on the geography, their geographic data is another piece entirely offered by a unified system. But some of the sort of sample uses of geographic data that we see and that we like to highlight as real opportunities when this information is gathered is really looking at which communities are presently underserved by your programming, perhaps, or by your exhibitions. Where you need to spend your very limited advertising dollars, which I know is a common challenge. Or perhaps where might a cultivation event have the most impact? A lot of that is maybe for the fundraisers. Looking at the communities where they perhaps could host some kind of cultivation event, all of this can be done based on the findings you get from your database. That's the sort of introductory piece, geography. When we get a little bit more specific, get down to the behavior level. This is where, again, you see a little bit more value from integrating all of your systems into one. You're thinking about what these visitors actually do at your museum and how they actually interact with you. So, for example, you might ask yourself, I have a large pool of members. I need to know where I should be investing my time and resources in re-engaging my members. So the folks who I know I'm about to approach for renewal, I want to really start thinking about who I need to start re-engaging in preparation for that renewal. The behavioral data you have in your system as to what they're attending at your museum go a long way toward answering that question. What events and exhibitions bring back multi-attenders for a second visit? I think that's another piece that's sort of a key hallmark of customer relationship management, is not necessarily always acquiring audiences constantly, but looking at how you can continuously engage the audiences and visitorships that you have. And lastly, and I apologize, you're welcome to throw spitballs at me every time I use the word audiences. I apologize. But many years of the theater world stuck in my brain. But the last category I want to talk about is relationship and life cycle. So really thinking not about individual transactions that your visitors have with you, not thinking about individual touch points, but thinking about the full breadth of time and the full dynamic of the relationship they have with your institution over the full course of their life with you. And I think the business questions that this kind of data can help you answer are, for example, is our new programming aimed at expanding our visitor base, really bringing in new visitors, or are we seeing the same people who've been coming? Again, you need to have that sort of baseline identifying information to answer that question, but it's a key thing that can be answered when you have it. Also, what is the migration pattern of your attendees from year to year? What are people doing in the course of several years as opposed to within the confines of one? And for example, how do the segments of my museum overlap? How many of our education program families are also member families? I'm throwing a lot of questions at you. I'm throwing a lot of sort of ideas here because what I want to really get at is that we're going to hear some case studies about how two museums have really been shaping their thinking around around the visitor and the visitor experience, but the number of directions this can go in is endless. So really, where can you begin? And this is my last bit before I turn it over. I think that coming back to this framework and coming back to this idea that you need to look at the whole as opposed to just drowning in data, which I think all of us are at risk of every single day. Without having a framework or a guiding principle as to how you think of your visitor data and your customer data, it's really easy for us to feel that paralysis because we don't know what to do with it. The recommendation I would make is to really start at this top level of this what this framework proposes, which is looking at the overall business objective, looking at the overall objective for customer relationship management at your museum. What are you ultimately trying to achieve? This, of course, says increased profitability. For you, that might be community engagement, that might be engagement with your content, whatever that might be. And then going down to the bottom and looking at the enablers. In the course of the work that the Tesseract Network does, we're of course very focused on the technology side of that, the integrated systems. We're also focused on the community and sharing ideas and innovating in that sense. But also it's about organizations and institutions looking internally at how their processes are currently set up and how their departments currently interact to create that, shall we say, balanced collaborative environment that is going to really get the most out of an integrated system. As I said in a presentation the other day, tools are not strategies, tools are just tools. And until you adapt the culture and until you adapt the way that you use them, they're not necessarily going to shift your strategies so much. That is my intro, because I want to let these guys talk a little bit more specifically about what they've achieved at their museums. But these are the kinds of questions we're chewing on, I think, as a company and certainly as a field. So I'm looking forward to hearing what more along these lines or completely separate lines you all are juggling in your particular institutions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Tarr from Natural History. Take it away.
Geez, that is loud. So I am Matt. You'll have to excuse you don't have to excuse, but the design here was done by my boss, who is not here. So I'll be presenting slides that match her aesthetic, not mine. Come Saturday, you'll see slides that look like I designed them. So I should probably clarify as well that the museum is huge. It's in New York City. It's a big dinosaur museum. And it is so big, and the silos are so potent that I think one of the real values here is what this does to that in that environment, what the thinking does in that environment. My job is actually the digital architect, is somewhat strategic, and then I deliver products as well. But the strategy when it comes to the CRM bit is really so fluffy as to almost be philosophy. So you might get a little bit of that as we'll see what these slides have in them. So we often think about the relationship of the museum to the constituents and how the organization is structured, right? We've got the education department, we've got the exhibitions department, we've got the membership department, we've got marketing, and everybody has their customers or their visitors or their constituents or whatever. But in fact, anybody who's ever been to a museum knows that they embody probably more than one of those audiences or whatever. Tradition. Yep, that's what we just said. Is that clear? Do I need to repeat it again? Sorry. So the whole reason behind this idea of CRM is actually it's been a long time coming. We moved on to the Tesseract platform almost a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. We started, whatever. Did the ticketing first. CRM is following. And CRM was sort of sidelined while we did ticketing because we didn't want to push it onto the back burner. So now it's up and running in a very real way. And there's a lot of notes here. Sorry. Yes. So I am a father of 4. I go to the museum. I have children who are the age of summer camp that we have, and I literally didn't know we had summer camp for like 2 years because I was not on the right email list of the people who put out the email list to parents, even though I may have said somewhere, somebody in some database that I had kids, that it wasn't connected. There's a long history at the museum of this sort of these silos, these departments, and their own visitors and their own customers or constituents or whatever they call them. Sometimes students, sometimes teachers, sometimes visitors, but they're all the same people, right? The teacher who comes to a professional development course may have children, and this has just been, we've been in complete denial about this for a long time. And so I guess that would be the teacher who also has children, is somewhere in the middle, who may also be a member and or a donor and or any number of things. So this idea of 360-degree view, like I said, started actually a couple years ago, really out of the education department's desire. The education department had obviously spreadsheets and databases of people who were in programs or who were in classes or whatever, and the head of that silo or groups of silos, Lisa Guggenheim, Senior Vice President, really wanted to see all of that pipeline of people. Who was coming in at the bottom and how long did they stay? Did they leave at 6th grade? Did they stay for the 8th grade programs? Did they end up in the shrimp program? Did they end up they end up coming back and going to graduate school at the museum? We have 2 graduate schools, so it became very important, and then it just sort of, that inertia and that work over a couple of years, and then with Tessitura coming in, became something that we could actually do. We start to look at visitors as people who intersect with us in multiple ways. Right, I think we covered that too. So again, it's that silo thing. It's kind of funny because I was at must have been at Tessitura conference, and there was someone talking about CRM and about what it can do for your organization, but the subtext was not actually what installing and creating and maintaining a CRM can do for your organization, but really it's about what the argument around the meetings around installing a CRM can do in highlighting the places where people have to say in front of a group of other people, those are mine, those people are mine, that list of humans is mine, and it's like actually 60% of those people are also on my list, and so they're not yours. There are no visitors or customers or constituents. Is there a generic term? No. Constituents for this education program. There are museum constituents, and they happen to touch us in different ways. So again, it's about collecting enough data that we can make those obvious connections between people, and also, of course, it's about not necessarily annoying the heck out of people by asking the same questions over and over and over again. It's like, in my case, when I sign up one of my multiple children to some program and have to fill out all these paper forms again and again and again. And if they take 2 weeks of summer camp, it's double and everything like that. Of course, there's a danger. Oh, good. There's always a danger. Analytics can be deceptive. Analytics can be used to tell any story you want to tell. I actually wrote down over here, beware the easily measured, right? Because we fall into that a lot. Is like something like Google Analytics. You drop that on your webpage, and all of a sudden you know everything about your visitors. It's not just about secret machinations. It's not just about pushing messaging out to your visitors. It's also about giving them value. We are an institution that has 33 million objects behind the scenes. However many tens of thousands on display, 45 permanent halls, dozens and dozens of programs. How do we get you what you want and need to know? Why did it take me 2 years to find out that we had summer camp? So really, this is not about maximizing value for the museum. It's really about maximizing value for both sides of the table, including all the individual departments. So let's.
Thank you. Take it away.
Hi. First of all, we have a summer camp. It's really great. If you want to be on the list, I'll set you up. Hi, I'm Micah Walter. I work at the Cooper Hewitt. First of all, before we start, who's heard of the Cooper Hewitt? Oh, awesome. Okay. Let me just apologize before I get started. This is my 3rd out of 4 presentations in the span of 3 days, I think, that I'm doing. So things are getting a little bit jumbled. These slides are a little bit jumbled. Things are going to be a little weird here, I think. So, and I'd like to keep it a little brief so we can jump into question and answer stuff, because that's really the purpose here. But it's great that all of you have heard of Cooper Hewitt. I think that might not have been the case 3 or 4 years ago, and we've done a lot of work to try to change that. For those of you who haven't, this is the Cooper Hewitt. It's a big house on the Upper East Side, kind of across the park from Matthews Museum. And I kind of like to think of the building as a user interface. This is something we always kind of come back to, where all the technology we've employed throughout the museum, all the things we do online, all the way that you get your ticket and technology devices when you walk in. These are all built around the idea of one cohesive user interface. And the reason I'm bringing this up in this presentation is because we're generating lots and lots of data through all these things. So one of the things that we have is this thing here. Have you guys heard of the pen? Show of hands? Okay. So I don't really have to go into too much detail about what it does or how it works, but basically it's a magical device that you walk around with. You collect things that you're interested in. You used our interactive tables to create designs and explore our collection. It's a really wonderful, transformative device. And if you ever get a chance to go up to Cooper Hewitt, I strongly urge that you try it out. We spent about, 2 to 3 years working on it, maybe a little bit longer now. It wasn't easy. It required a lot of prototyping and manufacturing and all kinds of things like that that are difficult for museums to do in the first place. But one of the things that it does a lot of is it creates a lot of data. And I guess this is a great time to plug my session for tomorrow, which is more in depth about the data that it creates. So if you're interested, come at 5 o'clock tomorrow. And one of the things that we did throughout this whole project was that we deployed a Tessitura ticketing system. And this was done for a number of reasons. And one of the main reasons was that we want to sort of, cultivate relationships, create long-lasting relationships with our visitors. And we felt that a CRM was probably a way to do this. At the time, we didn't really know what that meant. I would probably say that we still don't quite know what that means. But the other big reason that we went with Tessitura and a ticketing system like a CRM is that we wanted some way to connect the stuff that you do with the pen to your identity. And so, as you'll see, we have kind of a number of databases that are sort of separate, but they're all sort of interconnected by your identity, basically. Yeah, this is another thing we kind of talk about a lot, which is that the house or the mansion is the biggest consumer of our API. You all know what an API is before I go on? Okay, good. So, and this is an important fact because it really kind of, if you go back to the idea of the house as a user interface, it's really the biggest consumer of our API. We have a public API that you can use if you're a developer, and that's all good. But the house itself, the interactive things we have in the mansion, our ticketing database, all these things kind of tunnel through the API. And I'll sort of explain that in this next slide, which you may have seen before if you've been to any Cooper Hewitt talks. And this slide kind of explains how that all sort of fits together. And the way it kind of applies to this discussion is the bottom part. So on the bottom, we have on the left our collection database, which is TMS. And that provides all the information to our digital tables. It's the thing that kind of organizes all the data around what you collect with your pen. And it also stores all the things that you do with the pen. And then, of course, on the right, now we have this new thing, which is Tessitura, or our customer relationship management tool. And that stores all the information about you as an individual. And so these things are separated for a lot of different reasons. And they're just combined together by one thing, which is basically the ID of your pen and the ID of your ticket. And so this is sort of the reason that we went with this system in the first place, so that all this stuff could kind of work. And let's take a look at some of the data. So I mentioned that we're generating lots and lots of data. And this is one of those slides that we like to show in board meetings and that kind of thing. This is the first 6 months with our pen. And so we've distributed 69,000 or so pens. At this point, people had collected about 1.5 million things. So those 69,000 pens had walked around the museum and tapped 1.5 million things. I think it's over 2 million now. Visitor-created designs, so people walked around with their pens and created things on our tables and saved them 61,000 times. That's almost one per pen, which is really impressive. And we know things like, how much time people spend in the museum, how many people take the pen, all these sorts of things. And we can start to look at these sort of high-level statistics. And they don't tell us a ton of information. They kind of, they're big numbers. They're fun to look at. But now we're trying to do things like figure out how to look at the data in a little bit more in depth. So looking at things over time, looking at trends. This one stat back here where it says visitors who take the pen is 94%. Sounds awesome, but when you think about it, we really cram the pen down your throat when you walk in. You don't have to take it if you don't want to, but we sort of insist. And so that sounds really good on paper, but the real number that's sort of interesting to me is the next one down is of those people, those 94% who take the pen, how many of them don't ever use it? They just sort of walk around the museum and hold it in their hands. And that's somewhere around 26%. And that seems bad, but if you think about it, if you go down to the galleries and watch people using the pen, there's a lot of different behavior patterns going on there that sort of make sense. Like, for example, a family of 5 comes in, and the dad or the mom is the one using the pen, and the rest are just holding their pens and watching or something like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. But the point is that if you start to look at that data a little bit more in depth, you start to see that there's trends going on. So this is that same statistic where we see how many visitors are not using the pen over time. And we can see this big spike on the left. We made some bug fixes to our system, and we can see that starting to get better now. So there was a problem where people were just not collecting anything because of a problem with our underlying code. So all this to say that it's important to understand the data in many, many ways. And the difficult thing I think that we're having right now is trying to figure out what we actually want to know. All right, so I made this slide very quickly, as you can see. And I couldn't really find a good graphic that was for the pen. Everything else is not bad. So Matthew mentioned silos. Yeah, of course, we have silos. We're generating tons and tons of data. The pen, every time you tap your pen to something, there's a row in the database for that. There's logs of all the API interactions that go along with that. The data is growing and growing. So, of course, like most places, we have web analytics. We have Google Analytics and some other things. We have our collection database down at the bottom. Our Testatura CRM ticketing database is another silo. And so how do you start to sort of, build all these things together so you can look at the data together, so you can understand, if a group comes in, what's their behavior pattern with the pen, so if you can look at all the groups and match those up with their use of the pen, stuff like that. And so one of the things that we've been working on is building tools around this problem. So this is just a first attempt at something. We started working with Amazon's Redshift, which I'll talk a lot more about in tomorrow's thing. But Amazon Redshift is basically a data warehousing tool where you could basically figure out how to migrate all your data into Redshift on kind of a periodic basis, and you can use it to analyze across lots and lots of different data sets. And so I started building a kind of rudimentary website around that system, so you can start to do things like look at how this is an example of how one of our departments has grown over time, and eventually how collecting with the pen might apply to that, how ticketing might weave into that. There's lots of different ways to sort of slice and dice that data. And so this is another thing we did was just to figure out what the most popular things are. And this is the thing that happens when we have lots of data. You start collecting all this data, and it's like, what do you do with it? What do you want to know? One of the most obvious things that we came up with was, what's the most popular thing on Vue? What's the thing that people are collecting with their pens the most often? At the time that I did this slide, it's this paper folding dress. And so why is that the most popular thing? And so what I think is really interesting about this is that you can look at this data and really quickly answer that question. What's the most popular thing on Vue, or the most popular 6 things on Vue? It happens to be right now that the most popular 3 things on Vue are these little miniature staircases we have. And so do you take the answer to that question and decide to just exhibit staircases? Probably not. So you have to sort of figure out what you actually want to do with that data or that information. And from my point of view, I think the thing is to figure out what to ask next. Now that you know the answer to that question, now that you know how many staircases were collected, what's the next question that comes after that? And so building tools around those kinds of things is kind of what we're trying to do right now. Testatura has a nice kind of built-in warehousing system, so you can look at lots of aspects of the data right within Testatura. But there's still parts that you can't do right within there. So the pen is one of those things. It's sort of its own separate entity right now, and we're trying to figure out how to build basically analytics tools that let us look at all this stuff in a very holistic kind of way. Of course, we're going to try to open source as much of this stuff as possible. this isn't open source right now, but that's all right. So eventually we'll start opening up some of these tools to everyone, so we can continue to develop these further. But that's basically it. I'd really love to get into some discussion topics. Right.
Thank you, Micah. Is this on? There we go. Before we get to the Q&A, I just have one more thing I want to just bring up to both of these two guys to riff on a little bit. We didn't talk about it necessarily as part of the AM&H presentation, but I know you all have been hard at work on your Explorer app, which I'll let you talk about in a minute, which certainly not the same as the pen, but I think in terms of how it plays into the visitor experience, I'm curious to hear you talk about that. And then secondarily, if there are long-term plans for how the pen and as well as the Explorer app are going to lead into the sort of larger, let's call it marketing, for lack of another more inclusive term, I guess, but the sort of marketing challenge with visitors after their visit, and how you hope to use it sort of on the long term.
So yeah, we've got this application called Explore. It's a wayfinding app. It's been around for about 5 years now. It was one of the early indoor positioning systems. We're updating it in early December, mid-December-ish, and the goal of adding in a lot of sort of contextual and personal engagement with material. I'll tell you that while I personally installed close to 700 beacons to make the wayfinding piece of it work, what I'm most proud of is the fact that we convinced the museum to include this 6-second clip of cleaning the whale, vacuuming the whale, the model, that will be delivered to a visitor while they're standing under the whale thinking, how the hell do they clean that, you know? Hopefully that's what they're thinking. But I think that's exactly the point, is like, once you start to make these sorts of assumptions, right, then you have to be able to sort of back them up or back off. And I think one of the things I jotted down here was regarding Micah, a question for them is popular versus collected, and I would really be interested in knowing what was popular but not collected. You know, like how do we get at that kind of stuff when the technology that we're creating, and I should also admit, by the way, that Explore at the one we're going to release is not going to be tied into CRM. It's going to have ticketing in it. It'll know where you need to be and when, and tell you got 20 minutes to get there. But in a later version, spring, maybe next summer, we'll be doing like login, and then it'll all be part of your. So we're asking what your interests are, and those have been mapped sort of thematically to the interests that are in Tessitura, but there's not a connection to them because we didn't start API first. So we're sort of backing into some of these things. But anyway, so yeah, Explore is one of the front lines of this, which wasn't explained much there. But it is. It's sort of like where the rubber meets the road of how do you use this data to market to people in the building. And then, of course, it's all part of our strategy, which is before, during, and after, in this sort of continuity of visitor, not just am I a teacher, am I a parent of a kid in summer camp, am I a donor or member, but am I on my way to the museum in 3 months, am I at the museum physically right now, was I at the museum last week, and am I now supposedly a potential member or donor or something like that. So very interesting stuff, Explore, I think. If people will use it. The pen. Is this one?
Yes. Is the thing on? So your question about popular versus collected, I could comment on that a little bit, I think. So one of the things that happened with us was we jumped to the conclusion of things that are collected are popular. And we looked at our data about 3 or 4 months in of what are the things people are collecting the most, and we discovered that it happened to be this paper cut image of Noah's Ark on the second floor in the back of the museum. It's not our most popular object that we know in terms of how we think of popular objects, and it's certainly in sort of you have to kind of walk through the museum a bit before you get to it, and so we were really curious. Why is that thing collected? So much more than everything else. So we took it down because, that's what you do. And we replaced it with something else. And so this is just a way of testing if maybe it just happens to be that spot in the museum, or if it's just an attractive object or what. The thing is, it's what do you do with that information, even if you come up with an answer? Why do we care if something's popular or not? I was recently in Australia, and I went to Mona, which is pretty amazing place. And they have an app where you tap, if you like something, it's kind of like a hot or not sort of thing. As you walk around the museum, you just say love it or hate it. And from what I've understood, basically, if the things that people love, they take down and replace with other things. And so it's a reverse popularity contest. And I think that's really clever, because that kind of, it allows their curators to kind of, design exhibitions around something, in a way that's not just the popular, it's something else. But yeah, now I'm just rambling.
That's incredible.
Well, it's good rambling. Thank you, Micah. But I think something that is probably at least as interesting to me, I don't know if it's interesting to others in the room, is that, in both of these cases, the idea around collecting this data and collecting information about the visit and what the person is doing around the museum is not revenue focused at all. I mean, it's purely around engagement. It's purely around what they're actually interested in at the museum, which obviously in the long term has revenue implications, but is not the primary focus, which I think is, going back to the framework I showed at the beginning, which is from the for-profit world, is completely the opposite, which is, I think, great. But anyway, I will stop hogging the mic, and I will start running mics out to the audience. Testing. Barely.
Great. Hello. I was curious how you guys handle youth data in systems like this, in customer groups, and how you differentiate sort of a customer record having like an ID, like an email address, and grouping that among like a whole group of people where specific activities might be focused at youth, and just, both the sort of ethical implications, experience, and, technical.
Sure,
deals.
I can maybe answer that a little bit. So Cooper Hewitt's part of the Smithsonian, which is part of the government. So we have a lot of strict rules around that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we've tried to do with the pen is to make as much of it as possible anonymous from the get-go. So if you walk in, you buy your ticket, even if you buy it online, it's essentially anonymous. You can walk around and do your entire museum experience without ever giving up an email address or anything, until later on if you decide that you want to do that. And so, Smithsonian has certain rules around, if you're above or below 13 years old, that kind of stuff. All of our tessitura related stuff, where there's personal, PII information, is all stored in a PCI compliant area, and we do that, so that we're in compliance with all the things that we need to be. But yeah, that's the thing. I think the approach that you start anonymous and then you decide to not be later is sort of the driving force behind that. And when it comes to the age restrictions and that sort of thing, that's the next step. And when you sign up online, you can kind of work through that part of it. Does that make sense?
I mean, I can tell you that from our perspective, we had some inordinate amount of our web traffic over the last decade or more has been the Ology website for kids. And when we got serious about this ticketing process and things like that, the membership area on Ology, which had been COPPA compliant by simply being obfuscation, basically, was, and I don't mean that, you couldn't type anything in. You could choose two names, it would assign a number, and that was it. And there was no email, no things like that. But we took that down because, one, it was really long in the tooth, and two, because we want to do it right. Being terrified of COPPA is only going to get you so far. I mean, and this gets to something that I think is really critical, which is that the dangers around data and the fears around privacy and stuff like that is all true, all great. And I had lunch with somebody who was who would like to accuse me of being a bit hyper concerned about it. But the benefits, if the museum knew enough about me and my family, the benefits would be monstrous, right? So we want to do it right. But the value of the museum, sorry?
Monstrously good. You said the benefits would be monstrous.
That's good. Monsters are good. That's Barry. He works at the museum too. He works with kids. He should know monsters are good. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, I think the benefits will be fantastic. But we just backed off because it's too scary right now. So we'll come back around the next go.
Thank you. We had a question right next to you right there.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on your comment about kind of revenue generation, that I'm curious to know to what extent you've seen the systems that you've employed result in repeat visitation or increased level of membership. I mean, looking at the stat from Cooper Hewitt, about 40% of the people that use the pen then go home and look at the website that they've created, look at their objects. Are those people likelier to become members or likelier to make a repeat visit? Are you able to track that sort of data?
Yeah, so that's kind of why we did this the way we did this. And I think unfortunately, the problem is that we don't know yet. We've only been up and running for about 7 months with the pen now. So we're just starting to collect all the data, and we're just now getting into trying to figure out how to analyze it in the first place. But you're right. So if somebody goes and checks out their visit after they visit the museum online, and then they create an account and they associate that visit with their account, and then they decide to come back later, we're building up a long-term history with you, and that's really sort of the crux of this whole thing. That's why we are doing it. Whether or not it's going to pay off or not, whether or not we'll figure out, good or bad ways to market to you, that's kind of the next questions I think that us as an institution have to figure out.
Following up on that, thinking about the analysis that on the data that you have, how have you been working internally with staff in terms of training, in terms of development, in how they can interpret and then use this data to change practice within the institution?
Yeah, and this is the reasons behind why we're doing some of the work I showed up there right now, is that we don't really have those tools available to us yet. We have Tessitura, and it's good for what it's good for. It lets us understand really specific things about different members and that sort of thing. But I think the museum as a whole doesn't really have the capacity yet to do a real deep analysis of that data because it's new to us, and we don't have those types of roles in our museum yet. But I think eventually we will, and I think that's really where things are headed right now. We're not there yet.
Can I chime in from the wall over here? One thing that, I used that framework at the beginning, talking about enablers. Can you all hear me, by the way? Talking about enablers. If I were to make that for myself, I think one of those blocks on that bottom level would be improved data literacy. Because I think that in the CRM space and thinking about what all this means and how all this can be interpreted, that is in itself another layer of art and science. So I think it's an astute question.
I think all this is predicated on the assumption that increasing engagement will increase profitability, right? I mean, we all think that, but I think the value of this data is to recognize which levers create the biggest draw. You know what I mean? I think that I wrote down the word thresholds because I think that's what's super interesting to me is so if you can get somebody, who was it? Tessitura guy, the Surprise and Delight. There are these amazing thresholds where if you can get a person to come the third time, then they're there for life kind of thing. But if you can only get them there 2 times, then you lose them. That kind of stuff, I think, it's those treasures that are hidden in the data. Once we get all the data in, we can find that just pushing somebody from 1 evening event a year to 2 evening events a year means we get another several $1,000s lifetime value out of them or whatever.
What he's referring to is the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. If you look on YouTube, search Chicago Symphony Orchestra Tessitura, there's actually a video series talk all about that.
It's great. Check it out.
Thank you for giving me that wonderful section. No more questions.
How did you guys handle at your organization system ownership? And then would you give it to marketing for CRM? Is it by committee? And then also sort of data governance in terms of which departments are able to make that data actionable. So not necessarily exactly what you do, but how did you handle that decision-making process around system and data ownership?
So the short version is we're still figuring that out a little bit, but basically Tessitura at our institution is managed by our IT department. It's an enterprise class kind of system that has to have a good deal of resources thrown at it in that way. And within that system, we have a Tessitura manager who handles more of the business end of Tessitura. And they've identified what we call ambassadors in our institution. So we have different people from each department who kind of get volunteered to be ambassadors for Tessitura, and they're the ones who kind of decide or to kind of promote Tessitura within their own department. So it's a sort of organically grown kind of thing that's starting to, find its way throughout the museum. And that's a really good question, because this is one of the main issues we had when we first decided to go down the road of a big CRM like Tessitura, is that the buy-in from our staff is a big challenge. So trying to get it installed on everyone's machines and in their daily routine is a enormous challenge. Enormous is a great word. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of where we're at right now. I hope that sort of down the road it'll become part of everyone's sort of daily workflow, is to check out their dashboard on Tessitura, see what's going on, or whatever tools we wind up building.
And of course, the museum, the answer is meetings. Meetings.
Yes,
meetings.
lots of
But
meetings.
I mean, is it a select committee across some key different areas who are making decisions on what are the priorities of the system, what do we want to get out of it? As we sit down to build out that framework, who is it a committee of key departments making those decisions?
As a matter of fact, I knew this would happen. I bet Tom could speak, because he's our guy. So lots of meetings. There's a working group. There's like a.
I'll come back to the mic in the legitimate sense this time. Yeah.
We all work in museums. It's sort of a leading question for me, knowing what a nightmare that process can be. But I think it's key to get through.
It's the work that needs to be done, and it's the nightmare I wish more people put themselves through, to be perfectly honest, because it is a change in the working construct. When you go to this kind of model, in the case of AMNH, it is a sort of a two-tiered system. It's a steering group that really makes the sort of high-level decisions strategically for the museum, and then a working group that brings it to life and really pokes holes in it, finds where maybe it needs to be rethought or expanded or whatnot. But that's the approach they take. So there's the sort of C-suite that handles the steering level, and then the sort of director level who does the working group. But it is across the whole museum, pretty much everybody but the scientists.
You have scientists?
I have one question here and then in the back. Go ahead.
So I was just curious. We've talked a lot about meeting goals of revenue or getting visitors to come back or those types of goals. Have you thought at all about using this kind of data in terms of how it might meet learning goals or like the mission of your organization? I come from the learning division at the aquarium in Chicago at Shed, and we also use Tessitura. And I'm just curious from that standpoint of how could this data be used to say, oh, we're impacting this learner because they have come back and done this program, or oh, we're creating more inspiration or creativity or whatever your mission is. Like with the pen, I know you know which objects they went to. Do you know how it made them feel or how it changed about the way they think at all by what they're creating with this? Is any of the data able to be a little bigger than just revenue and attendance?
Yes. I mean, we don't know. We don't know how they feel. We just assume they feel good. But more seriously, so for education, that's sort of one of our next steps is to roll out our CRM and apply it to our education department. So all of our public programming, all of our education events, all those things, we run a camp, which I mentioned. So we're looking into figuring out how to use Tessitura to handle registrations for campers, and to the point about people under 13, that's an issue. So we're trying to figure out how to kind of fold Tessitura into that existing workflow. And then I think the next step after that is figuring out how to use the data behind that to, like you say, make informed decisions based on, what these people or what these learners are learning. So I can imagine a scenario where we would, maybe market to, a certain set of programs to a certain set of, high school kids or people who have come to 3 or 4 programs or something like that. All these things become possible once you start kind of funneling this all through the CRM. And I think that's really kind of the main goal that we have, is to kind of use it as sort of the nexus for all these things.
If I can add to that, I don't think that necessarily all of the data that we're gathering as a result of CRM work necessarily answers all the questions. So, for example, if you need to isolate, and I don't mean lock in a closet, but isolate, identify, this segment of people that participate in your programming in a certain way, you might need to then take that out and do some additional research, qualitative, quantitative. But it at least gives you the opportunity to really narrow that field. So, for example, when I was talking about the 3 types of data before, and I talked about relationship and life cycle, looking at people who've been either coming for a certain period of time or have participated to a certain level of depth, then doing some outside research on those folks because you really know them, would get you a little further to, I think what you're talking about is mission metrics, around what your real purpose and reason for existence is. I hope that helps. We have one back there.
Hi, I'm curious as to why you chose to go with Tessitura instead of another CRM and ticketing platform like Blackbaud Alltrue or other options.
Is she a plant?
I had nothing to do with that question.
Tessitura, well, it was a while ago. Why did we go with Tessitura? Well, its birth from the cultural sector was important. We spent a long time looking, and there was a lot of different pieces. I think we liked the leadership. We liked. I don't think Tom was there. I'd make a joke about Tom.
It's okay.
But I think it had a lot to do with that. I mean, it's the combined CRM and ticketing. I mean, it's like those 2 things are inextricably linked in what we do. For those people who we know who they are. So it seemed like a time and complexity saving effort. And yeah, we just spent a long time looking. Talk about meeting, boy, and travel and all kinds of stuff. I think we liked what they had, and we liked where they were going. And where they were going was where we needed to go, and that was a big deal. We're one of the big general admission. Is that what we call ourselves? The big general admission, or admissions. Anyway, there are a lot of proscenium and seats in Tessitura, and we don't have those so much. But they were saying the right things about how the system was going to change to meet us where we needed to be.
For us, I think one of the biggest factors for choosing Tessitura was the kind of community that's based around it. So Tessitura only works with nonprofits, I think. Is that correct? Yeah. And they run a pretty gigantic conference once a year. And we were really attracted to the idea that the community that's built around Tessitura has a really great influence over the direction that Tessitura takes. So if there's things that we think it should have in the future, we have a really great position to lobby for those things. And that was really important to us. The other thing that was really important to us was that it has a pretty open and extensible API. So we can bend it and make it do the things we needed it to do. Yes?
Hi, I have kind of a nuts and bolts kind of question about time. I'm with a non-collecting contemporary art museum, so we're going to be changing our exhibitions every 3 months or so. If we were to want to implement something like the pen or use a beacon system for wayfinding in this particular exhibition, how feasible is that in terms of updating the content on that time frame?
I mean, that's an awesome question. It really depends on what kind of tools you build around the systems that you're deploying. So, for example, at Cooper Hewitt, we have these interactive tables. They're full of all kinds of content, and every time we change exhibitions or every time we want to change one object in the exhibition, our curators have kind of a CMS that they can log into and make those updates pretty seamlessly. And that didn't used to be the case. It used to be that they would call up the digital department and they would tell us what they wanted us to do, and we would go and do it for them, and weeks later or months later, it would be done. Now they have this sort of, they're enabled and they're empowered, and they can kind of run the exhibition in a sort of real-time basis. And so for us, it's very fast. We can, once the exhibition is up and installed, the curators can go into the CMS and really basically build the content on the digital tables in a matter of a day or two, depending on what the size of the exhibition is. I think that's unique to us because we've built those tools, and it's non-trivial to build those tools. So yeah, it really depends on the scope of what you're trying to do. I'm sure there's a beacon CMS out there that you can stick those things on the wall and have it up and running in an afternoon. I don't really know, but yeah, that's about that.
Yeah, and I can tell you that even though we did not use an existing CMS to power our beacon stuff, the content has taken longer than the beacon system for sure. I mean, it's just, in our case though, our content is almost never reusable in the classical sense. Like we've tried this for decades, you know, to harvest content from other places to use in this, but like once you start talking about contextual content, you know, then, you know, why are you installing an entire system to track user location, age, demographic, interests, and then giving them the same, like then you have two different descriptions instead of 12, right? Like, so don't build a system that bifurcates your audience in 12 ways and then have two pieces of content for them, you know, a lower grade level reading and an adult level reading, you know? So content is by far the hardest thing to do in this world. I mean, not this world, I mean, there's harder things to do, but I mean this world, the world of contextual and personalized content.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. Any last questions while we have the time?
Any last words?
Okay. Well, then in that case, we'll give you 5 minutes back. Thank you all for your attention. I want to say that Micah's headshot makes me feel like the biggest stiff in the world, but I enjoyed very much. And thank you all for your contributions. This was a really interesting chat.